G'day guys, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into hypereutectoid steels, what they do, why you need to know about them, and how we can deal with them. This is going to be a little bit more of a theoretical dive into the nature of steel. If you're interested in more practical aspects of heat treating, I'll leave a card to my playlist up here that goes into the actual practical application of heat treating and the like for steel. In this case, we're going to be talking about hypereutectoid steels and what they are. So, I actually had a conversation with a fellow YouTuber and friend of mine, Alex from Valhalla Ironworks, recently, in which he pointed out that I regularly refer to hypereutectoid steels without really explaining what they are. Part of that's a faux pas on my part. I spend a lot of time reading metallurgical textbooks and bladesmithing, jargon and stuff like that. And so therefore I kind of automatically assume that people understand what I'm talking about. The other part is that it is a fairly complex topic, but it can be explained in very simple terms. So what I've done here is just outlined the very basics. If you're interested in a more deep dive into the subject of hypereutectoid steels and how they work, I will have one of those available to my Patreons. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff and more behind the scenes stuff, please feel free to check out my Patreon. But before we get into that, the four main phases of steel that everyone should be aware of. There are others besides these, but these are the four main phases. Ferrite, Pearlite, Cementite, and Martensite. Now, these are all cold steel phases, right? These are all steel where the steel is at room temperature. These are the phases that it can be in. There is one other. And then there is austenite, which is the phase that steel is in above critical temperature. So critical temperature being the phase at which, or the temperature at which, steel has all of its carbon into solution and is transformed uniformly into one phase. When you cool steel, and in this case we're not talking about quenching, so martensite is not something we need to worry about in this examination. This is purely about slow cooling. So when you slow cool material, you will have either both, all three, or one of these phases. And that all comes down to its eutectoid. That word there. eutectoid, eutectoid. Now, what is eutectoid and why does it matter? The carbon eutectoid of a steel is basically the percentage of carbon in a steel that can go fully into solution. The way I like to examine it is to talk about sugar and water. If you take a glass of water and pour sugar into it, you'll get to eventually a point where the sugar will simply sit in the bottom of the glass and will no longer dissolve. You can heat that water up, and some more sugar will dissolve, but even then, once you've heated the water all the way to boiling point, you will still get to a point where you can get no more sugar into that water. And the reason for that is because it's become completely solute. It's a super strength solution. It's super saturated. So in steel it's the same thing. Carbon and iron need each other to conjoin in order to, create the carbides and stuff like that we need for hardness. So at a certain point, which is this magic number here, 0.77, it's actually between 0.76 and 0.77% carbon. That is the magic number at which every carbon atom and iron atom has a bedmate. It has complete uniformity throughout the piece of material, and they can all create one mass. They can all create one certain phase on our diagram. So, the eutectoid, and you can have eutectoid steels, is 0.77%. Most eutectoid steels that you will play with will be like 1080 and 1084. The reason for that is because you do get decarburization during heat treatment and stuff like that. You also get variation in steel eutectoid, in steel carbon content. So That is why 1084 is such bandied about as being such a great starter steel, is because it is close to a eutectoid steel, which means that it's really, really forgiving when it comes to heat treatment. Now, hypo and hypereutectoid steels, most of the time you're referring to low alloy or no alloy steels. So you're talking about W2, O1, even those tend to have fairly high alloys in comparison to what we're talking about. We're talking about very low alloy steels, maybe some manganese, a little bit like that. So for this instance, we're going to be talking about W1, which is a standard file steel that most of us will be very familiar with. W2 is basically the same, there's a little bit of variation in the alloy. But for this instance, W2 or W1 is a hypereutectoid steel. It's got 0.1 to 1.1% carbon in some cases. We could also use 1095, which is 0.95% carbon, which is above the eutectoid, which is that 0.77 or 0.76% carbon. For a hypoeutectoid steel, we'll say, take for instance 1045 or 4140, although 4140 is a fairly high alloy content steel, but we'll say 1045 and 1095 just to make it easy. So these two steels have, you know, a very basic alloy content, very low alloy content, and the main difference is going to be their percentage, their carbon percentage. We've got 0.95 for our 1095, we've got 0.45 for our 1045. So the hypoeutectoid steel, when cooled at room temperature relatively slowly in still air for a normalization cycle, as most of us will be familiar with, you will form two phases from this chart. Technically you're actually forming all three, but Pearlite, which is the center, is a combination of these two phases, ferrite and cementite. So what happens in Pearlite is that you have cementite, ferrite, cementite, ferrite in layers. And ferrite is basically pure iron. That's basically the way I want you to think of it. It is basically pure iron. It is the softest it can get. It is the most ductile that the material can get. Cementite is Fe3C, so it's three ferrum, or iron atoms, combined with a carbon molecule, or carbon atom. So it is a harder and more brittle element in the steel. It's a harder and more brittle phase. But because of the layering effect, you have a uniform soft material. And the slower you cool the material, the wider those bands get. So if you imagine like the grain of wood, if you've got a very tight grain, you've got that young wood and the late wood, young wood, late wood. The thinner those grains, right, you've got more cementite per square inch than you have ferrite. Whereas the larger those grain lines, those larger lines, you've got more ferrite in that area, which means that it's softer, which means that it's more malleable and a lot easier to drill, that kind of thing. So that's why when you anneal, you want to cool as slowly as possible. But because the hypoeutectoid steel, which is 1045 in this instance, does not have enough carbon to go around, it hasn't got that perfect percentage where every iron atom has a bedmate, you instead get proeutectoid ferrite, which is before the steel cools to the cooling temperature, so 727 degrees Celsius, before it gets below that temperature, it starts to form ferrite. It immediately starts to form this before starting to form anything else. And what that means is that you end up getting grain boundaries. If you imagine you've got several grains, you get boundaries between them of ferrite, of just pure ferrite. Very soft material, very ductile material. So that is why you'll always end up with a softer material normalizing a low carbon steel than a high carbon steel, is because you get those ferrite grain boundaries around pearlite, which is still a fairly soft material. In a hypereutectoid steel, like 1095, you've got more carbon than you need to create a fully pearlitic structure. You've got more carbon than you can give to all of the iron. So you end up with proeutectoid cementite, that hard, brittle stuff that we were talking about earlier. So instead of having those nice ferrite grain boundaries, you have that hard cementite grain boundary. You've got hard material surrounding pearlite, surrounding that soft material, which is why when you try and drill hypoeutectoid steels, even when you've annealed them, or, in this case, normalized them, and normally if you anneal them, they're easier, but even when you normalize hypereutectoid steels, you can develop carbides. You can develop that cementite. You can also get carbide clusters because you've got so much extra carbon, especially in the much higher carbons, the 1.1, 1.2% carbon, right before the cutoff to cast iron becomes evident. You get even more chances of forming carbide clusters. Now, if you've used tungsten carbide tooling in like end mills or drill bits, then you'll know that tungsten carbide is one of the hardest materials we work with other than diamond. The reason for that is because of those carbide clusters. So in this case, you end up with carbide clusters in your steel, which is why if you've ever tried to drill a normalized blade and you've kind of drilled halfway through the material and it's just started skating and screeching at you and you hear the drill bit burning up and it all gets hot and nothing happens, that's why. It's because you've hit a carbide cluster or you've hit a rather large proeutectoid cementite layer. So you've hit a boundary between two grains because maybe you've overheated the steel when you've done your normalization. You've hit a boundary that is quite large that's made purely out of this nice hard brittle cementite, and you're never going to get through it with a standard drill bit because this stuff is as hard as the hardened martensite. And also carbide clusters are why you end up snapping drill bits. It's because you go through a nice piece and as the drill bit comes around it hits that carbide cluster and just stops and bang, there goes your drill bit. So that is the difference between hypoeutectoid and hypereutectoid steels. It's purely a carbon percentage game. Now, the reason that hypereutectoid steels, I talk about it quite regularly, is because hypereutectoid steels, because they have such a high carbon content, come with a lot of drawbacks. They come with the drawback of having a lower melting point, which means that they're harder to forge weld to things, because obviously if you need a higher forge welding point for one steel and a lower for another steel, then getting them to meet in the middle to weld without melting one or burning one becomes a lot more difficult. Also, with your hypereutectoid steels, you also end up with red short, which is when you're forging a blade, you've overheated it slightly, but you think, it'll be fine, you hit it with a hammer and it goes kapoof, and you just have grains of steel all over the place and it crumbles to pieces. That is because you've got overcreation of this cementite. The grain boundaries have become so large, the grain has become so large, that it just crumbles, falls apart. It's really common with files, especially if you burn them. That's what's happening. You've basically created pure cementite grain layers, and that just completely messes up your day. So, hypereutectoids come with drawbacks. They do have positives. Obviously, being that they are super high carbon, you are almost guaranteed to get full martensite transformation when you do your quenching, provided that you quench at a reasonable speed. The reason for that is because you've got enough carbon to migrate into the iron. So therefore, you're almost guaranteed to get a nice hard blade out of the hypereutectoid steel because you've got so much carbon. And those carbide clusters that we talked about before, granted, you have to have a very fine grain structure, and that comes down to your cementite as well. If you've got that nice fine grain structure, you've got a very hard blade with those cementite boundaries that can withstand a lot of wear, because, that's why files are made out of W2. It's because it's a very wear-resistant material. That's why hypoeutectoid steels, those lower carbon steels, are used in, shock absorbent industries, like 4140 is used for hammers and stuff like that. The reason for that is because it's got these ferrite boundaries. Those grains are surrounded by proeutectoid ferrite, which then protects or cushions the grains from being smashed around. If you have cementite in its place, there's no cushioning. That's like putting your head against a plank of wood and then having someone hit the plank of wood with a mallet, instead of putting a pillow against your head and then someone smacking it with a mallet. They're still both going to hurt, but the plank of wood is not cushioning the blow at all. It's just directly implementing that blow straight on your head. So that's why hypoeutectoid steel is really good in shock applications, and hypereutectoid steels are very good at wear resistance. But anyway, that is why you can't drill your normalized steel. Now, the way to get around it, there are two ways to get around your hypereutectoid steel hardening into carbide clusters. One is really good temperature control. If you don't have a kiln or an electric oven, stuff like that, then you want to either have a laser thermometer or a thermocouple that you can stick into your forge, control that atmosphere or control your environment in the charcoal or coal, and get a really nice 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 750 degrees Celsius, to try and get the grain growth to slow down, to decrease in size, and get that pearlite to start forming. The slower you cool it, the smaller the pearlite layers, the larger those pearlite layers become. Those ferrite layers and the cementite layers kind of drift apart. So that's why annealing is annealing and normalizing is normalizing, is because annealing requires that you slow it down really, really slow. For instance, when I do it, what I tend to do is my forge is very, very heavy, it's very, very thick, and therefore it maintains its heat for a very long time after I shut the forge off. So at the end of a long day's forging, if I have any blades left over that I want to anneal, I'll stick them in the forge, heat them up to critical temperature, and shut the forge off. And what that means is that it's going to take 5 or 6 hours for my forge to drop down to room temperature. And over that 5 to 6 hours, you are incrementally decreasing the heat of the piece, and that means that you're going to really slowly form those grains. The way you can do it with a charcoal forge, charcoal is amazing for it because it burns even after you stop giving it air. So what you do is just heat it up to critical temperature, bury it in the bottom of your forge, keep all of the charcoal there, and let it burn down to ashes. In coal, it's not such a good thing because you've got a lot of clinker and all that kind of stuff, and it goes out the moment you stop blowing air on it. So if you're going to use coal to forge, if you want to do your annealing and heat treating, maybe you switch to charcoal for that process. Just for the process of heat treating, maybe switch over to charcoal, chuck some charcoal in there and make it work. But hopefully that helped you. I will be doing a deep dive for my Patreons, as I said before, and I'd really like to say thank you quickly to Jared, Nathan, Andy, Kine, Rich, and Braden. You guys are all fantastic people. Thank you so much for your support. It means a lot. I am working on some practical stuff. I am working on some forge work. I've got some really cool collaborations coming up really soon, so keep your eyes out for those. But other than that, I really appreciate you guys checking this out. Share it around with your friends, obviously, anyone who might want to know about this kind of stuff. And if you want me to cover any other kind of steel deep dives or stuff like that, please let me know. I love doing this kind of stuff. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about it. So with that being said, please give the video a like. It does help. Leave a comment down below, even if you just want to say hi. And I will see you on Saturday on my next live stream. Cheers, guys.